Bonjour.
First of all, thank you for coming. This hangover Monday on this Shushan Purim.
Speak for yourself.
I did.
Thank you for the coffee, especially today. Okay.
Why do you think I should accept? It's a double shot.
Well, that was a last minute.
I'm teasing you.
And this also is the last class before our Pesach break, so we thank you. It was the end of the semester. We all got an A.
Only an A?
Only
They get A plus, right?
there's bribery works. Now,
Is it TC?
in today's class, what we're going to do is we're going to do three things. Doesn't mean it's going to be longer. Worry not. I know some people are busy cooking up a storm and have to be pulled out of the kitchen, right, Liz? But what we're going to do is we're going to do something, say something in honor of Shushan Purim.
Oh, beautiful.
It is right now in Yerushalayim. They're celebrating, so it's appropriate to say something in honor of Shushan Purim. And then we're going to have two insights into the Parashat HaShavua. That's what we're going to do. Does that work well?
Yeah.
That works well. We close the back door. Is it cold a little bit from this?
Yeah, very
Freezing, you said.
It is?
It's freezing.
Remind you of Winnipeg a little. Now, what we're going to do, you got everything here? Good.
Sorry, is Anshul here today?
Ancho's no, it's his day off. It's
Oh,
hangover. Now, in honor of Shushan Purim, I'm going to share with you something. Here, look. But I'm going to ask forgiveness from Murray and from Avi.
Ooh.
The two of you we had that Thursday night discussion a few weeks ago. Remember, and we discussed a little bit about an issue of Yerushalayim, the 1949 crisis of Yerushalayim. Remember that?
Yeah.
Two of you remember that. So I've touched upon it, but I'm going to expand a little bit, and I'll share it with you. You
told us about it once.
How long ago? You remember things. That's the
No,
problem.
about the when after the war.
After the war.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
so we'll review that briefly.
three
Very
days
impressive.
before Purim Day.
Oh, you see, you're giving it all away. No, let's do that briefly in honor of Shushan Purim. We'll just share it, 10 minutes perhaps. We'll share with you. I think it's for me, it's very inspiring. This whole discussion. What was that? I'm going to give every detail. Believe me, I'm going to share with you every detail. I'm always inspired by this. One of the most uplifting sections of Jewish law. Really, I really feel it. And the story is as follows. We all know that when they establish this holiday called Purim, they decide that it's going to be celebrated on 2 days. The 14th of Adar for all cities. However, if you have a city that is walled, and thus it is similar to Shushan Habirah, they celebrate on the 15th of Adar. Purim celebrated like in Shushan Purim. So we're familiar with that. What's the idea behind it? Well, as Jews, we don't want to celebrate the day of battle. Remember that. The 13th of Adar, the 13th, is the day they wiped out the anti-Semites. They fought their enemies. They rested the day after. We're not celebrating the battle. We're celebrating Jewish continuity, that we are around afterwards. So that's why we celebrate on the 14th of Adar. However, in Shushan itself, they needed, for whatever reason, to continue the purge one extra day. So they rested the next day, meaning they continue wiping out enemies on the 14th. They rest on the 15th of Adar. That's when they celebrate Purim. We know, right, the rabbis know that for many years there's no guarantee that there are going to be Jews in Shushan, and they want to commemorate this concept, so they established that all cities that are similar to Shushan celebrate on the 15th. Now, they go ahead and they say the following: we're not going to link a wall to a wall that is present, but rather if you have a city that once upon a time had a wall, that will be considered a walled city. And they say that it's not once upon a time in the days of Mordechai, Esther, and Achashverosh, but rather in the days of Yehoshua Binun. If you have a city that is walled from the days of Yehoshua Binun, and they had a good reason for it, because if they would have established the fact based on a wall being present in the day of Mordechai, it would have cut out all of the cities of Israel because this was a desolate land. Israel did not have walls. The cities were destroyed. This was the 70 year in between the destruction of the first temple, the second commonwealth, the rebuilding of the second. Israel did not have a Jewish presence, and thus cities did not have walls, so they established it from the days of Yeshua bin Nun. So this is a concept we are very familiar with, and the one city where, without a doubt, it had a wall, from the days of Yeshua bin Nun, and we know exactly where that city is obviously Yerushalayim. So therefore, right now in Yerushalayim, Purim is celebrated due to the fact that it is the 15th of Adar, Shushan Purim. Good, that's what we know what's happening. Now, comes the Talmud, and the Talmud tells us that areas that are adjacent to a walled city have the same status as the walled city. And there's some questions to what extent. The Talmud presents the fact that even if it's not right next to the walled city, but rather if you stand in the walled city, you see a village, that village is considered as well part of the old city. One of the authorities notes that even if, let's say, it's a distant city, but it is considered part of the big city, it's part of the same municipality, perhaps it's considered part of the old city. So thus, in the 19th century, from 1865 and on, as there is an expansion out of the old city of Yerushalayim, and they're building these new neighborhoods, like Mishkenot Sha'ananim and Nachlat Shiva and Mea Sha'arim. They're building these neighborhoods. Those neighborhoods, the rabbis say, have the status of Yerushalayim, and you celebrate on the 15th of Adar. Now, there were some neighborhoods that were built quite a distance from the old city, more than a kilometer away, and there was a question among the authorities, and they had to deal with these newer neighborhoods that were not right next to Yerushalayim. For example, in the 1920s, Rav Kook had to deal with the question about this new neighborhood called Beit Vegan. And the question was, what's the status of Beit Vegan? So he writes a tshuva about it. And then we are very familiar with the questions in the 1980s about a place called Har Nof, or in the early days it was called Givat Shaul Bet. What's the status? Is it considered still part of Yerushalayim, and thus 15th, or perhaps not? There was a question about Ramot, which is a remote neighborhood, right? Yeah. And they had that question, what's the status about these locations? So we are familiar with this material. However, the big to-do has to do with a statement in the Jerusalem Talmud. Now you know very well that in general, what the text we turn to guide us in Jewish law and in Jewish philosophy is the Babylonian Talmud. Because for the past 1600 years, this is the go-to text on anything that is Jewish. We have a tremendous amount of respect and reverence for the rabbis in the Talmud, and therefore the Babylonian Talmud is that text that guides us. At the same time, there was a Jerusalem Talmud not as popular. Many rabbis were not even familiar with it for many centuries. But little by little, I would say over the past 1,000 years, it's re-entered the study hall, and it is discussed, but it's never considered as significant as the Babylonian Talmud. But nevertheless, a statement in the Jerusalem Talmud is taken into consideration, and there are many, many practices that we follow based on statements that were written in the Jerusalem Talmud. Jerusalem Talmud was not written in Jerusalem, it was actually written in Israel, right? It was a final text a century or more before the Babylonian Talmud, but it's a very significant text. Here comes a statement in the Jerusalem Talmud. One more introduction. Often, due to the fact that the Jerusalem Talmud was not studied so much by these earlier authorities, we have question marks about the reading. Sometimes there is a statement and we're not sure how to read it. And there are different girsaot, there are different versions how to read it. So here comes the statement that the Jerusalem Talmud deals with. The Jerusalem Talmud asks a theoretical question. So many discussions in the Talmud are theoretical, right? It's a theoretical question. The Jerusalem Talmud asks, what happens if you have a walled city from the days of Yehoshua bin Nun, and you have a nice Jewish community in the walled city, and then next to it there is a village, next to that walled city there is a village with a nice Jewish community. So obviously that village next to the walled city has the same status as the walled city, and they're going to read on the 15th. But what happens? Charav akrach v'naaseh shel akum, meaning the Jewish community within the walled city is lost, gone, and there are only Jews next to that walled city. So then, when would the people who live in the area next to the walled city, when are they going to read? In other words, now that you don't have a reading or a Jewish presence within the wall, what's the status of those next to it, right? What happens? What do you do? Theoretical question the Yerushalmi asks. And the Yerushalmi answers, now by the way, it is so theoretical at this point because it's very, very possible that this statement was written in between the year 135 and the year 350, because that's the bulk of the Jerusalem Talmud. And in those days, there were no Jews in Yerushalayim, because after the Bar Kokhba rebellion, they kicked out. The Jews were kicked out of Yerushalayim. There were no Jews in Yerushalayim at that time. And as a result, what the closest place the Jews were able to go to pray and meditate with proximity to Yerushalayim was Har HaZitim. And as a result, there were many prayer gatherings by Har HaZitim. That was like their kotel, their closest location. And even for centuries later, there were some that kept up the custom of praying in Har HaZitim because that was the old location, even when they regained access to Yerushalayim. So remember, this is a theoretical question because there are no Jews in Yerushalayim at that time. But the Talmud asks the question. The Talmud responds, you should know. And these are the 6 words that you have to be aware of. Bo einan korin, and the simple reading is, within the city itself, they're not going to read on the 15th. Ubechutza lo korin, with a question mark. If within the walled city, they're not reading on the 15th, and they're not celebrating Shushan Purim, because there is no community present, so you expect those outside of it to read on the 15th? Obviously not. They're going to read on the 14th. Now that's the most basic reading of the Talmud. And there was a commentator that wrote and explained the Jerusalem Talmud by the name of Rabbi David Frankel. He was well known more for his disciple. He had a disciple by the name of Moshe Mendelssohn. So he was the Rebbe of Moses Mendelssohn. And he wrote a commentary on the Jerusalem Talmud. And that's the basic explanation of the Jerusalem Talmud. Right? Outside, you can't read on the 15th if there's no one inside. A theoretical statement, unfortunately, comes 1948. And the Jordanians kick the Jews out from the old city. You have Jews in the new city, which the new city was a new concept, didn't exist in the days of the Talmud. And suddenly you have the question, what happens in Yerushalayim, Purim, 1949. There are Jews in the new city, next to the old city, but no Jews in the old city. What happens? Right? What do? Do we have to start announcing, telling the community of the New Jerusalem, who for decades have been reading like Yerushalayim, have felt that emotional, spiritual, halachic connection to the old city of Yerushalayim, that from this point on, you are going to be reading Megillat Esther and celebrating Purim now on the 14th. That's what the simple reading of the Jerusalem Talmud is. But this is a major change, a very significant one. So the rabbis decided to deal with it. And the rabbi who really wrote the responsa to address it, and this became the accepted practice, as we're going to hear soon, was Rabbi Herzog, Rabbi Yitzchak Isaac Herzog, who was the chief rabbi of Ireland, then in 1936 moves to Palestine, became chief rabbi of Palestine, wakes up one day in 1948, and he has a new title, chief rabbi of the state of Israel, right? It's nice to have a new title without having to schlep and move and pack, right? So he has a new title as the chief rabbi of the state of Israel, a major Torah scholar, a very well-respected individual, father of Chaim Herzog, which we all remember from 1975 in the United Nations, and future president of the state of Israel. His grandson, who was named after him, Yitzchak Herzog, is never going to be prime minister, and he's also the head of the Labor Party. So Rabbi Herzog deals with this issue, but if you look at the date of his tshuva, so how long, this is a significant issue, how long before Purim would you say is it logical to address it? 6 months before?
A day.
Thank you. So yes, that's what they follow. They think like you, Yud Aleph Adar. 3 days before Purim, right? They decide to address the issue. So this is one of those fascinating tshuvot. And he notes in his tshuva himself, oh, listen, I don't have a lot of time to spell out all the details because I must get my bottom line to the newspapers by tomorrow morning because they have to publish to tell people in Yerushalayim when they should be celebrating Purim. So now he gives several explanations, and what he wants to do is he wants to be 100% sure that Yerushalayim, the new city, continues celebrating on the 15th. And he argues his point by number one telling us that yes, the basic reading of the Yerushalmi is the way we have explained up until now, but the Gaon of Vilna reads it differently. The Gaon of Vilna takes that same statement, and the way he reads it is as follows, that Bo'enan Korin, true, within the walled city you're not going to read on the 15th. But Bechutza lo Korin, meaning not as a question mark, not as a question, but as a clear statement. Outside, continue reading on the 15th. In other words, the Gaon of Vilna, for whatever reason, reads it not in the way that is expected, but in a way that is stating, continue reading outside of that walled city that no longer has Jews, continue reading on the 15th. It's very shocking that the Gaon of Vilna goes against, and when you read his words, it is very clear that he is not willing to read the Jerusalem Talmud the traditional way. And he, I would use the word stubbornly, sticks to a different reading. It's as if he was a prophet, right? As if he sensed that one day this is going to be a relevant issue, which is quite fascinating for a rabbi in the 18th century to go ahead and read the Jerusalem Talmud in a way that becomes relevant 150 years after his passing. Now, Rabbi Herzog also continues with some different ways of defending the practice, but what he says is the following, that you should know, that if God forbid we go ahead and tell the Jewish people in Jerusalem that we start reading the Megillah from this point on, due to the fact that we lost the old city, we should start reading the Megillah on the 14th of Adar. If we detach ourselves from the old city, if we do it, it's going to be a head gadol ba'olam. It's going to be a big shock, right? Shock waves in the world that we lost hope of Jerusalem, right? I always like pointing out that when you take your tour of the Knesset and you see the Chagals there, and Chagall is painting it, it seems to be it took him a long time to make those the paintings that you find, and in one of them you see like a bubble, like a dream bubble. It's an image of the state of Israel. You have people who are busy in the image itself working the fields, and there's a bubble which indicates a dream. What was the dream? What was the mindset of the Israeli in the 1960s? Yerushalayim. In other words, they never lost hope. There was always this dream that somehow we return to the old city and to the Kotel. So Rabbi Herzog writes that if we detach ourselves halachically by declaring that from this point on we are no longer attached to the old city, but we start reading on the 14th, it will send shockwaves throughout the Jewish world, ki'ilu, as if, chas v'shalom, God forbid, hitya'ashnu, we have lost hope, meha'ir ha'atika, from the old city, ad kidei kach, to such an extent to make a shinui, to change something in a religious matter. If you change something in a religious matter, that's significant. That would be something that would be devastating. We have never lost hope of the old city. This is what he writes in 1949. That became the psak, and they kept it on the 15th. They continue keeping it on the 15th, and thank God, 1967, the question is no longer relevant. Yes?
What happened after the Bar Kokhba rebellion when they kicked all the Jews out of the old city? When did they lay in the Megillah there?
So
then
there was no adjacent communities next to the old city in those days. There was nothing. Meaning, when they kicked the Jews out of the walled city, there was no one there in the old city, and there was no one in the region.
There was nobody by Har HaZeisim?
Har HaZeisim, nothing there. It was an empty, it was an empty area. The idea of having a Jewish presence outside of the city, right? They had, here a little bit of, a Moshava Rusi, but a Jewish presence and communities only starts with the Moses Montefiore in 1865. It was a new idea. So this is a very uplifting section that you could go ahead. You study so much halachic history, And almost every single time it's about a Jewish community kicked out of France or kicked out of Germany or kicked out of Poland or dealing with a pogrom or dealing with a cemetery that's that. Most of halachic history is depressing. And here you could go ahead and share in a situation and a challenge that we look back and thank God things are better. So this is a very uplifting section in Jewish law, the whole idea of expanding Yerushalayim, right? With all the challenges that exist there. It's an incredible thing to read about, and it's quite uplifting. So that's how this is in honor of Shushan Purim. But now we have to turn to the Parashat HaShavua for two insights. Okay, two insights. Page 490. 490. Now, the first one is going. The first insight is going to be a reading. Where the Torah on page 490, which is chapter 31, and we're going to turn to verse 13, where Moshe Rabbeinu is going to present to the people of Israel, as God tells him, about the Shabbat. Shabbat. Very quite fundamental for us. This is obviously not the only place, not the first time we hear about the Shabbat, but if you read carefully the way it's presented here, and we're going to compare it to the way it is presented in other places, you will see a variation, and that's what we want to address here. So here in verse 13, Va'ata, Moshe, Daber el bnei Israel, speak to the children of Israel. Lemor, saying, Achet Shabtotai Tishmaru, go ahead, observe my Shabbat. It's a sign, Beni Uvenechem. It's a sign, it identifies who you are. To teach the world that God has sanctified you. Verse 14, Ushmartem et Shabbat, Kodesh ilachem. Very good. Now the verse I really want to focus on is verse 15. So now let's read it carefully. Sheshet yamim, 6 days, ye'aseh melacha. Work shall be done. Ye'aseh melacha. Ubayom hashvi'i, and on the 7th day, Shabbat, Shabbaton, not just the day of rest, the day of complete rest. Kodesh LaHashem. Good. At the same time, you're going to do me a favor and turn to page 410, and we're going to look at the Aseret HaDibrot, where Shabbat is mentioned, and there are going to be some small variations that we're going to address, and this is on page 410, on the top. Zachoret Yom HaShabbat lekachor. Remember the Shabbat. Sheshet Yamim, for 6 days. Ta'avod. Should work. Ve'asita kol melachtecha. Go ahead and accomplish all your work. V'yom HaShvi'i Shabbat. And the 7th day is a Shabbat. LaHashem Elokecha. Now, the two differences we're going to address. First is the obvious one. In the Aseret HaDibrot, it's just Shabbat, a rest. Here we are told it is a Shabbat Shabbaton. And throughout Torah, whenever you're going to read about the Shabbat, sometimes it will be presented as a Shabbat, and sometimes a Shabbat Shabbaton. Number 2 is, while in the Aseret HaDibrot, it is addressing people who work, Sheshet Yamim Ta'avod, here, in our parasha, it is Sheshet Yamim Ye'aseh Melacha. Work will be done. It's not talking to the worker, right? Perhaps to the intellectual. What's going on here? So I've heard from my father an explanation that he got from an earlier authority, the Torah Tamima, that says the following. When you look at the Jewish community, there are those that go to work. And then there are those that they work, but it's intellectual work. Maybe they are indeed intellectuals. Maybe they are rabbinic scholars who are studying. There are those who during the week it is te'aseh melacha. They're working. There are those that during the 6 days they know that work is being done, right? Because they obviously do have their coffee, and they do have their breakfast, and they do have their clothes, so they know that there are people working. So there are those that Shabbat is ye'aseh by others, and there are those that the Shabbat is ta'avod. Now, the difference is, for the person who works, who throughout the week is just, they're chasing their tail, they're really running around. Comes Shabbat, right? It's like a zone. They're so happy that finally Shabbat has arrived. They can't survive without the Shabbat, right? Life makes them meshugah. Shabbat gives them rest. What happens for the scholar, right? What happens for the intellectual, right? The fellow is studying there, he's in Kollel, right? He's studying the words of Torah. In what way is Shabbat going to be different? In what way is it going to be different? He's spiritual, right? He's probably continuing his studies. So it must be that Shabbaton could be understood as a complete rest and some kind of spiritual rest. In other words, as you know very well, when we talk about rest on Shabbat, it is not just not working. But there are many laws we are familiar with, right? You have to know how to make a glass of tea. You have to know that there are guidelines if you do land up in a city without an Erev, right? You have to know what are you going to, be carrying, what not, right? So there are many details, many details. And when you are mindful of them, your Shabbat becomes an enhanced Shabbat. Shabbaton. So it works as follows. This is the explanation given. For the person, like we are reading about here, who it's a ye'aseh that others work, for him, his responsibility is to be mindful of the details that make the Shabbat. The Shabbaton. Those details that make it very precise, right? The details that give it its identity in the Jewish law. For the person who works, he has a better understanding of the spirit of the day. The person who works, comes Shabbat, he knows very well that this is a day of rest. But the goal in Judaism is always that there's communication, right? That there are those that understand the spirit of the day, and they're supposed to educate those who know the letter of the law, and so too those who know the letter of the law are supposed to educate the spirit of law. You know what I mean by that is when I was 20-something years ago, we were in Kollel. We're in Kollel. And in Milwaukee, the routine was that during the day you could study, and at night there's an expectation that all members of the Kollel study with members of community, which was very nice. People would come in, and you would have an opportunity. Quite often, due to the fact that you're dealing with a young man in his 20s, educating people, in areas of Talmud or Jewish law, perhaps that are a little bit older. So just as there's an education that's occurring from the Talmudic scholar to the layman has a lot to educate the Torah scholar as well. This is something that I sense. So there's a following story that's occurring, that one of the Kollel people is ready to start his learning in the evening, and he comes in with a tea. And he's sitting in the Bet Midrash, and he has his tea. So what we call the balabos, meaning the member of the community who comes in, was offered a tea by the Kollel fellow, and he says, nope, I would not drink in a study hall. In other words, there's a Sefer Torah here. This is a house of prayer. For me, I'm walking in. This is the place where I feel the presence of God, right? I will not eat in such a place. That's what he noted, in a very friendly way. And he added, for you spend your whole day here, this is like a home for you. If it's like a home, you have every right to eat and drink. For me, I'm walking in, I spend here perhaps an hour a week, 2 hours a week. This is not a place where I want to go ahead and make it like my home. I want to be inspired. So the feeling this young Kollel got is that, this is an education where perhaps I'm teaching him the letter of the details of Jewish law, but the spirit and the sensitivity is coming from the layman. That's what he mentioned. Remember here, when I got to this shul, that there was one of these local newspapers. They're not Canadian Jewish news. One of these local Jewish newspapers was being printed. I don't remember which one. And they would dump and run. In other words, they would leave it here. Better if we don't think of what name it was. But they were advertising. They had on the back page a big advertisement for some meat store. And they were advertising in it for the other white meat. For meat that we as Jews not just don't eat, but rather it is the symbol of not kosher. So this is in a newspaper, and a lot of it was about Jewish culture and Jewish movies and Jewish sport figures and Jewish actresses, and so it's a very Jewish paper, obviously. And then in the back, they had something that was now for me again. I look at it and I analyze it from a halachic perspective, and I say, listen, is anyone in this shul going to go ahead and pick it up and say, aha, it was in a shul, I'm going to go buy it? Obviously not. So I approached it from a very narrow halachic vision, and I said, you know what, it's not my responsibility of throwing it out. Now, I was wrong. Why was I wrong? Because Jack Schwartz walked in. And Jack Schwartz looks at it, and he says, what to do? Jack, expresses his feelings very well. And Jack says, this got to go, not kosher, it's a shul. And he was right. Why? I approached it with the letter of the law. The letter of the law, sometimes it's dangerous. When you take the letter of the law, there is a spirit as well. The way we succeed as a nation is that we have this communication, right? That you have someone that walks in, someone who is a Jew of Ye'asel, the others were. He has to teach the Shabbaton deals, right? Details. He has to get up and give a lecture on the laws of Shabbat and how you heat up food and how you go ahead and you make your coffee. That's his responsibility. The others have to teach him the spirit of Shabbat. The spirit of Shabbat. So that's what the communication we are addressing. That's one insight on the Parsha, and I promised two, so I have to give you one more. Ready for the last one? You're ready for the last one. Okay. You're familiar with the Chet HaEgel. Did we mess up or did we mess up? Oh, yeah. Now, you know that the high priest doesn't wear gold when he comes in Yom Kippur to the Holy of Holies? High priest, Yom Kippur, Holy of Holies. He has gold on his vest, right? No gold. Some people, I think, have a practice. Is there such a tradition? You don't wear, I never wear jewelry, so it's good. Again, the spirit is being done. No gold. Why no gold? Why? What's the issue of gold specifically on Yom Kippur? Yom Kippur is the Day of Atonement. Atonement for the big sin of the golden calf. So we have a rule in rabbinic literature, en kategor, that when you have a prosecutor figure, he cannot turn around and become the sanegor. He cannot be turned into a defense lawyer. Meaning gold was the problem. Don't bring gold into the picture. Don't bring your gold into the holiest place when you're seeking atonement for the sin. And every sin carries within it the sin of the golden calf. No gold for the high priest as he enters into the Holy of Holies. Very familiar with it. Now the question we're going to ask is, wait a second. You know who walks into the Holy of Holies? Who was the first one who walked in? Aharon. Did he play a role with the golden calf?
Marginal.
What was that? You tried to minimize it. It's very nice. Okay. Aharon HaKohen, he actually made it. He did make it. So it's quite fascinating that gold, no, Aaron, yeah, he's okay. And Aaron HaKohen is everything to us. Ohev Shalom, he is the symbol of the Jew concerned, a spiritual Jew. He is the symbol of service. He is the symbol of Avodah in the Beit HaMikdash. And does he get a pass? It's a very interesting question that has to be addressed. So now, to understand the sin of the golden calf, I'm going to share with you a midrash. The midrash tells us that Moshe Rabbeinu, earlier in his career, when the Jews are still in Egypt, he is at Mount Sinai, communicating with God, when the nation is still there. And he has a vision. And he senses that the nation of Israel is going to experience the revelation as they are standing there at Har Sinai. He has a big smile, like he experiences the revelation beforehand. And the Almighty says to him, Moshe, you're enjoying your experience? Moshe says, this is incredible. A whole nation standing there, sensing God, connecting to you, learning your laws. God says to him, hold back there. Moshe, Ata ro'eh re'iyah echat. You're seeing one thing. You have a vision of one incredible thing. A nation connecting to their Creator through this experience. Unfortunately, says God to Moshe, Ani ro'eh shtei re'iyot. I see two things. Ata ro'eh, you Moshe, you see the nation. Ba'in leSinai u'mekablin torati. You see the good. Unfortunately, Ani ro'eh, I also see that mitbonenin bi, they see me, She'ani ba bekaronin. I come with some kind of carriage, meaning I didn't arrive on my own. The Medrash tells us God did not arrive on his own. He came with the carriage. And the carriage itself had images. The Shomtim and the people of Israel are going to take one of the Tatramulim, one of the 4 mules, Tatramulim. And they're going to go ahead and take the image of the ox and worship it. Now, what does this really mean? Imagine you have a child. You have a child, 2-year-old, 3-year-old, and you tell them that we have a nice Shabbos guest that's coming, and he has a very interesting job. He does something very, very fascinating. He's a detective. So the 3-year-old asks, what's a detective? So how do you explain to a 3-year-old? Detective is, he helps catch bad people, like Batman. Oh, like Batman? Kid gets it. So then, they open the door, the guest walks in, and what does the 3-year-old cry out? That's not Batman. Where's Batman? I want Batman. Starts crying. Right? That's the people of Israel. Let me tell you a little bit why. God needs to appear to a nation of former slaves, not a very educated nation. And the nation needs to understand that God is all-powerful. How do you communicate with a nation that grows up in the fields, understands agriculture and nothing more? How do you indicate to them a powerful, mighty, strong God? An ox is an ox of a god, right? And this is one of the images they have when they are experiencing. They're standing there at Sinai and they have a prophetic vision. The vision as an ox to communicate with them that God is ox-like, mighty, magnificent, beauty, strength, power. So what happens after Kabbalat Torah? Interview the average Jew. What is God? What do you mean? God's an ox. Right? That's the problem that's occurring. This is what the Midrash is telling us. So now, Aharon HaKohen, what we are being told is the following. When the nation itself enters into panic mode, Moshe is not coming back. What they seek is some kind of idol to worship because that's what they grew up with in Egypt. But the problem is that this is a nation that is dispersed. This is a nation that they were not just seeking one type of avodah zarah, they were seeking many. Elohim arbe ivulam. They had a desire, each person, the Jewish people, each one thinks their own way. And even then, they had a desire to worship a pagan force, but the pagan force you chose is not the one that I chose. We are different. Aaron HaKohen was concerned that the nation is going to fall apart. What does he do? He created that image. And this is an image that was linked to God because it did appear for the sake of keeping them together. This is what Ramban Nachmanides tells us. He wanted to keep them together. And that is really the essence of Aaron HaKohen. When my father, when he went to Mexico, he's planning his first experience in the rabbinate in 1975, 1976. And he had a relationship with a rabbi. It was a rabbi who was in Toronto decades earlier, would come back to visit here. His name was Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky. So well-respected rabbinic authority in North America. He was in Toronto before your days. I think he left in 1938, but nevertheless had an impact, and he would come back to visit. And Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky was guiding a little bit my father about his experience in Mexico. But he reminded him that it is very, very important that you be, to the community there, very supportive of the state of Israel. Now, this was not said by a person who was known as a great Zionist, but it was someone that understood very, very well that if you have a secular community, right, and that their attachment is not perhaps through Shabbat and not through Kashrut, it is a must to be supportive. You have to have, the state of Israel is that net that keeps us together as a nation. The state of Israel, correct? With all this, with the problems that exist, but the reality is, it is so important to be supportive because that keeps the nation as one. And we know in the United States of America, one of the greatest tragedies over the past few decades is the fact that the average non-observant Jew perhaps a Jew that even does not even come on Yom Kippur to synagogue, 40 years ago you would interview them, they valued the state of Israel. Where Hollywood could produce a movie in the 1960s of Cast a Giant Shadow, right? That was a movie supportive of Israel. It kept Jews connected. And nowadays, unfortunately, when we're losing that, right, when you have so many Jews who are supportive of a party, right, that is very, very close to nominating someone that is anti-Israel, that's a tragedy that is extremely painful. So what Aharon HaKohen is the Ohev Shalom and Rodev Shalom, the lover of peace, the unifier of the people of Israel, senses that this is what I need to keep the people of Israel together. When you keep the nation together, when you keep us, when you have something that brings us together, even if it is an egg, even if it's a golden calf, it has a value. It has a value, he has a value. He, Aharon HaKohen, is going to play a significant part in the Mishkan, which brings us together. That's what the temple is. We turn towards the temple in prayer. It is the place that unifies the people of Israel. He has a role in the temple. He has a role in the Bet HaMikdash because he had and played a role in keeping the nation together, even though it was a Egel HaZahav. This is what the commentators explain. And this is an important message as we walk into our seasons of Pesach and we finish our Purim. The nation of Israel as one is number one as a priority. Viewing ourselves as part as a nation, that's how we begin our journey. So I want to thank you all for coming throughout the season and wishing everyone a very meaningful Pesach preparation, a very meaningful Chag HaCherut, and may we merit as a nation together to be unified and experience the complete redemption. A good day, everyone. Thank you.